Hello and welcome to another Willowbank lesson in art. I hope that you're all well and keeping safe. Today we're going to be looking at some watercolor techniques and different ways of using watercolors. Watercolors are quite intimidating as a medium, or they can be. They're very difficult. They can be very difficult to use, and they work so differently to other materials like acrylic paint or oil-based paints. Now, I'm aware that some of you, or quite a few of you, might not have watercolors at home. So what I'm doing is, as I go through these processes and these techniques, I'm going to also try it alongside, and I've done a few examples here. I'm going to try it alongside working with food colouring as well, because food colouring works quite different to watercolour, but on the same hand, I found as I've done this process, where I've done it in food colouring and watercolour, I've slightly preferred the food colouring version. The reason for that is because if you're painting with food colouring, the colours are just, this is food colouring here, the colours are just can be so much more vibrant than watercolours. Okay, if you see here on the edge of my paper here, this is where I was just sort of testing and playing with mixing with different food colourings as well. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to look at, the first technique we're going to look at is going to be wet on wet, which is this technique here. This is going to be technique number one. What I have when I'm painting in watercolors, I will have some different brushes to use, different sizes. I tend to paint more in big brushes anyway, but that's just a personal preference, and I do go down to smaller ones, but I don't tend to go down much smaller than this really. Now what I've brought here with me is to show you a couple of other brushes that I have. I've got so many brushes here at my house, but these particular brushes are what are called hog hair brushes. Now hog hair brushes are, well, they are what they say they are on the tin really. They're made from hog's hair, and you'll find with these are a lot more rigid, a lot stiffer as a brush. They're a lot coarser. They tend not to absorb the water and the fluid as well. So if you have any brushes like this, I probably would avoid using this type of brush because you're not going to get the same effect. You're going to really struggle. So I'd avoid using this type of brush. What you want to be looking for is, and it can be any soft brush really, is softer brushes like this. And the reason these are much better, these are often made from horsehair, or you can get synthetic ones. But the reason these are much better is because they really absorb the water, and they store the water in the brush quite well. Alright, for this demonstration, I'm going to be using this round brush here. So you have your tip of your brush here, and then you have here. This is where the if you can see on the video, this is where the water is stored, and it's important not to overload your brush with paint or water because it can get quite messy. So to try and keep a bit of control over the amount of fluid that I have in my brush, I use a piece of tissue. I always have a piece of tissue by the side here. So these are my watercolors, and I apologise now for the state of my watercolor palette. I would like to say it sometimes is cleaner than this, but it's not. This is it probably at its best. I cleaned it special for this video. And then also as well, I have another palette here, which I'm going to be using the food colouring on. Now this is a palette that I use for acrylic paints and other paints that you have to work straight from the palette on. If you have a palette that looks like this at home and you're going to use it for mixing watercolours, I would probably say don't. Now the reason I would say don't is because this palette, as you can see, is quite well used. And if you're wanting to mix colours, as in to achieve different shades of green or blue and so on, you can't always see again, you can't always see the green and blue against these colours all in the backdrop. So it's okay for this video because I'm not mixing colours. I'm just going to be using this for putting on my food colouring to give other examples in food colouring. Okay, so I said at the beginning I was going to do the wet on wet first. So that is where we're going to begin. If I just move this across, at any point I am expecting this lot just to fall all on the floor. I'm just going to secure a little bit of room here for this video. There we go. Let's put these. That's better. That's a bit safer. You really don't want to get water food colouring on your floor because you'll upset a lot of people. Right. So the first thing we're going to do for this is we're going to paint on your page. You're just going to paint a square. I think I've got that. I think you can see that on the video. I'm just going to paint a square of water. Now you won't see where the water's going on the video, obviously, because the water is clear. I'm using watercolor paper for this. The reason why I'm using that is because the water just sits better on the surface. It doesn't absorb into the paper as quick. The difference being it's got a slightly textured surface and it's a lot thicker as a paper, so it can take the water better. The techniques that I show you, this one here is probably going to be the one you struggle most if you don't have watercolor paper or a thicker paper than what you'd normally use. Now, this technique is often favoured by landscape painters and seascape painters. And what you do is, so I've wet my square. It's quite drenched with water, and I'm just going to go in with this. And if you look as I go in, you can see how this this colour just sort of flowers out. And this is a really good technique if you were going to paint in clouds or waves or something like that into a picture. It's a really good technique. Now, as I said, we're going to look also at using food colouring for this video, so we can sort of see the difference and see how they work. Food colouring actually works really well in this technique. So you're going to have to, depending on the sort of, this is a food colouring, this is from Sainsbury's. Red food colouring is quite thick. I don't know if that's the same in all brands, but what you're going to, this works a lot better if you water this down slightly. I'm going to apologise now if you can hear a child screaming. It's because they're having their nappy changed. This is first thing in the morning and my children are getting ready for the day. Here we go. And then you can see this works just as well, I think, with the food colouring. And then if we go a little bit neater, you can get some really nice vibrant colour there from the food colouring. So in this technique, food colouring is a winner. It works really well. The only thing I will say with food colouring that you don't get with the watercolour is around the edges of the food colouring, it sometimes yellows slightly. That's just with the red. It's just where the pigment's just sort of seeping out a little bit. That's the only thing you're going to find with food colouring slightly different with that. Okay. So that is my wet on wet technique there. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at working a bit drier. So this is where you are going to need, I'm really not organised this morning for stuff. I've got stuff everywhere at the minute. This is where you're going to need a tissue, and I'm just going to take off some of the excess water from my tissue here, so it helps me get a bit more control on where the water's going. Okay, and then I am going to just go in here. I'm using I'm literally just, as I put my brush in the water to wet my palette, I'm literally just dipping it in the edge there to wet my palette. I'm just going to take that little bit of water off that I put on there, just dipping it in, and then that's how I'm wetting my palette. So I'm keeping my palette nice and dry, and then I am just going to go across And if you're using watercolours, this is a very, very good way of getting nice, vibrant colours. And you'll see as I go, the paint just wears off the brush and it will gradually get lighter there. So that's what it looks like with with watercolours. Let's have a look to see how this is going to look if we try this technique with food colouring. Now, food colouring will need thinning down slightly. You can't use it as dry because it can be quite thick. Depends on the food colouring, really. So I'm going in here and I'm taking my food colouring quite thick. And then I'm going to go alongside and we'll see what happens. I really like that, actually. That works really well. What I'm noticing here is that the fade that you get with the watercolour is less obvious. That's one thing I'm noticing here. It's vibrant all the way through, so you get less of a fade. Maybe if we just added a little bit of water to that and dilute it down a little bit more. Should we just give that I'm just going to give that a go. I'm just going to add a bit more water to this. See if it makes any difference. It looks slightly different. Yeah, you get. I think if you add a little bit more water, you do get a more a better sort of fade on there. But I think I prefer it with less water. I like this vibrancy of this colour here. So yeah, so that's a winner, and that works well with the food colouring as well. So we've got two techniques so far. We have got the wet on wet, we have got the dry, and we've got the dry with the food colouring as well. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you another technique, and this is a layering technique. So this is layering paints and building paints up through sort of just putting thin coat after thin coat after thin coat, and then gradually it will get darker and darker and darker as you go along. So I've prepared two sections here because you need to leave it to dry to do this, and to get these sections here, what I did was I took my paint, and I didn't go too wet with my paint. I took it actually quite dry. I don't know if you can see what I'm doing now on the video. There we go. And then I just then went along the page and I just did it in lines like this. And as I brought this down, I got a nice gradual fade with the paint. I say, so I've done the blue again. I've done the blue in watercolour, and I've done the red in food colouring. The food colouring one has worked well so far, but similar to the wet on wet, I'm noticing that there's a little yellow fade in there as well. So that's the only drawback with that. But at the minute, it's working quite well. So I'm going to take a little bit of blue onto my brush, and so once you've got that, you leave it. Watercolours really don't take long to dry. 5 minutes, leave it 5-10 minutes to get to dry, and then I'm going to go back in with the same colour blue, and I'm going to go back in over the top of what I've just painted. Now it'll be interesting actually, because with watercolour, what happens is when you go back over into something, it reactivates the watercolour. What that means is the watercolour underneath will interfere with the watercolour that you put in over the top. So for example, if I was doing this over a green paint, the green would merge with the blue and you'd get this sort of like muddy colour sort of starting to appear on what you're doing. So it'd be interesting to see whether that same thing happens when I'm using food colouring. I know that with inks it doesn't happen. The inks don't reactivate once they're dried. So it'd be interesting to see if a similar thing happens here. But as you can see here, I've gone over it again, and you might not be able to pick this up on the camera, but there's a very distinct line there, and you can see it's getting a lot darker. Okay, so we're going to do this again with the red. So I'm going to go back in on my palette with the red, and we're just going to. Thing is with food colouring is it is very messy. You get it everywhere if you're not careful. And I'm not the tidiest worker, so I am just going to put a bit of food colouring on here, and I'm going to go over the top again, and actually that works really well. That's gone over the top of that, and that's really worked. That's really worked quite well. I'm really pleased with that, actually. And it's not interfered with the paint underneath, with the food colouring underneath. I think that I'm really pleased with how that's looked. This would work really well if you was painting some sea, or if you was painting a sky or something like that. Something that you need to have a clear line between dark and light, but you don't want to leave white page. This technique works really well, this layering technique. Okay, so the next technique that we're going to use is we are going to attempt to blend the colours together. So we're going to blend from one colour to another, and we are going to blend from yellow to green, and I've got an example of that here behind me. So if you can see this here, we're going to blend from yellow to green. Okay, I've done the same technique here with food colouring, and I found the food colouring, the finish wasn't as good, I don't think, but it was a lot easier to blend, if I'm honest. So first of all, what we're going to do is I'm going to go from yellow to green here, and I'm going to do it in watercolour first. So I'm just going to move my my page across to get to a clear bit of page just here, and I've just lost my paintbrush. That was here, and I am the first thing I am going to do is no, actually the first thing I'm going to do is going to be clean a little bit of palette, because you do need a clean bit of palette. So this is where, as I said at the beginning, you're better off using a white palette or a lighter palette that's quite clean to see the color, see how the colors mix together. This is how often I clean my palette. I can barely get the watercolor paint off it. There we go. So I've got two clean sections. I'm going to use one of these for the food colouring, I think. Okay. First of all, we're going to go with the yellow. And I'm just going to put a bit of water on there. And I am going to take some yellow from my palette here, and then I'm just going to put that on the edge. I'm not going to mix that straight with the water yet. I just want it there. Now, even if you're using watercolors like I'm using, that come from tablets like this, it's always good to use a palette just to control the amount of water that is going to go into your watercolor. So there we go. I'm just going to. Now my water, because I've been using the red food colouring as well, has actually become quite contaminated with red. So if you're doing what I'm doing, you'll find that a lot. Right, here we go. So we're going to go in, and then there we go, as I go across like that. And you'll see you'll get a gradual fade there. Okay, now I'm going to go in with some green. So I'm using this emerald green on my palette. It's quite a vibrant green, and I'm just going to put that on the edge there. Okay, and I'm just going to mix a little bit of that in here. So I've got about a 50-50 ratio here with how I'm mixing my paint, and then I'm just going to start off sort of here where it sort of fades, and I'm going to work this back into the yellow like so. Okay, And then I'm going to take the emerald green again, a bit neater this time, and then I'm going from there and I'm going to work this into where I started and pick up that little bit and then go into there. There we go. Okay, it's a very noisy day today. There we go. And that, actually, I'm not happy with how I've done that, if I'm honest. I don't think I've quite got the grade. And I'll tell you where I've gone wrong. I've not washed my brush properly. So as I've gone to blend it back across, I've not washed my brush properly. As I did in this one, I blended it back across, but I washed my brush properly and I got a much better gradient. And you can see here, my green has slightly contaminated my yellow. So it is practice, and that's how sometimes it goes. It's practice, and it's good to get these techniques down before you start applying them to your pictures and paintings. And then now what I'm going to do is I am going to try it with water, with food colouring. Okay. So I'm going to just put a bit of food colouring on there and see how this goes. And this time I'm going to be a bit cleaner with how I wash my brush. And I'm going to go in with the yellow first. Again, I'm going to come across with the yellow. So I'm just going to wet that down a little bit more because I think that's a bit dry. So I'm going to come across with the yellow, going across, and let that fade out quite well. It's quite nice, actually. And then I am going to come in with a little bit of this green. And I'm just going to, again, I'm going to mix 50-50, play around, see how it goes. The food colouring might mix, the mix might be a bit more vibrant with the food colouring. And then I'm going to come back across. Now you can see how easily that blended as I went across. Really pleased with that blend. Okay. And I'm going to come back across here, and I've got a nice blend here coming across. Admittedly, with the green, it's not as vibrant perhaps as I would like it to be. I mean that's partly why I prefer the watercolor with this over the food colouring. So I'm just going to put in a bit more green, see what happens. But having said that, it all depends on what it is that you want to achieve. Because if you want that sort of that lighter finish, then that's fine. I think you're winning with the food colouring. So it all depends on what it is you want to achieve. Now, the next technique is we're going to use a slightly sketchier technique, and we're going to sketch on colours and work trying not to let the colours bleed into one another. So to do this, I am first of all going to use some yellow to paint in some stars. This is when you might need your slightly smaller brushes with this technique. So I'm going to paint in some stars like this, and then I'm going to put on here as well. I'm going to put a moon on here like this. There we go. I'm putting a moon like that. Okay. And then what I'm going to do, I'm going to take purple actually. And I am then going to paint around the edges, and I want this to go around the edge. But what I don't want it to do is I don't want it to touch the edge of the star and what it is I've painted on there. I'm cutting in, leaving a little bit of a white line around the edge. And when it's dry, this sort of white line looks really effective, actually. This isn't as purple as I thought it was going to be. In fact, this isn't purple. This is blue. obviously a colour I've not used for a little while because the tablet looked purple. There we go. And we can go in here and then we can add this. We can add this in like so. And also trying some of the different techniques that we use. You can see here how that's bled into there. That's okay, I don't mind that so much. But as you can see how the technique and how it sort of starts to sort of stand out around the edges, it is actually really quite effective as it sort of comes in around the edges. But it's at this point you might want to change your brush size and use a smaller brush. To be quite honest, I tend to use the same size brush with paintings all the way through. But that's just the style of how I paint and draw. So now we're going to try the same technique with food colouring. Unfortunately, I don't have any blue food colouring, but we can have different coloured skies. That's fine. I'm going to go with the yellow that I've already got on here. So I'm going to go with the yellow that I've already got on here and move my paper page across so you can see it. And I'm going to paint on. I think the one thing that I will say about painting with food colouring like this is food colouring, sort of it acts differently on the page. It's more transparent when it goes on, and it tends to absorb into the page a lot differently. So it's quite hard to work with. I'm just going to do that star again because I'm not happy with how I did that because I wasn't thinking, I was talking. Here we go. There we go. So we've got the star there. Put the star on. Maybe put a bit of a moon down here. Okay, and then I've got some red already mixed up just over here. It might contaminate a little bit with the yellow that's already on my palette that I've not cleaned off. And I'm just going to go in there again. I think for this technique, I really think that watercolor is the winner here. I think watercolor works much better. I think it just, for painting like this, it just sits a lot better and a lot differently. It does. I do think watercolor is the best for this technique. Okay, so what we have here is we have quite a few different techniques for you to play around with. We've done our wet on wet. We've done our dry fade. We've done our layering technique. We've done our colour fade over here, and a more detailed technique here. So what I'd like you to do is to go away, find anything that you want to use to paint with. So if it's going to be watercolours, use watercolours. If it's going to be food colouring, use food colouring. And then just play around with the materials. Maybe if it's a nice day today, which I think it is, get outside, paint a few flowers if you can see anything that you want to take a picture of and paint. And just play around with them and see how each material works. And if you've got both watercolours and food colouring, you might want to mix it up and mix the two together and mix food colouring and watercolours and see how that goes on. I'd really like to see some of your results. I know a few of you have emailed your results to me in your drawings, which I really appreciate you sharing those with me, so I can look at how you're getting on. So if anyone else wants to do that, that's perfectly fine as well. Okay, well, take care now, and I will see you again soon with another video on the Willowbank YouTube channel. Bye bye.